Okay, good morning. My name is Dr. Alok Pandey and I teach anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hyderabad. In today's lecture, I will be talking about the interface between environment and civilization. Why do we need to discuss the interface between environment and civilization? Is because human beings have the capability to bring about a change in the context of the environment by their various activities, by economic engagement. They have the capability to transform the environment, and that is why we need to understand the concepts of civilization and environment, because it is human beings who have created or constructed civilization. And this construction or the creation of civilization has come by transforming their environment. And that is why we need to engage with an understanding of the interface between environment and civilization. But before I get into the discussion of the concepts of environment and civilization, let us just take a minute to understand what do we mean by interface and why are we talking about interface between environment and civilization. Interface basically means a common boundary, right? It is a meeting point of two systems. Why should we talk about an interface? Because on one hand we have human beings, on the other hand we have the environment, or can be understood as nature, right? But human beings engage with the environment in order to survive, right? That is why human beings have to engage with the environment. In other words, it is the common point between the environment and civilization, right? So an interface is basically a common boundary, the boundary where civilization and the environment meet. And when we are talking about civilization, we are inherently or implicitly meaning human beings, because it is human beings who have culture and the capability to use culture to transform nature and also guarantee a survival for themselves. So that is why culture becomes important as a way of mediating with their environment. So interface is a common boundary. The boundary that we will be exploring is environment and civilization. Where do these two boundaries intersect, interact, and where human beings shape the environment and where the environment also shapes human life. And to understand this, there are diverse perspectives in anthropology, and that is why we need to engage with it in order to understand the interface between environment and civilization. What can we expect out of this lecture? First, we will try and understand the concepts of environment and civilization, and in the process we will learn the linkage between these concepts and its implication on human society in the past. This is important because civilizations have risen, civilizations have vanished, and civilizations continue. But what is central in all this is the capability of human beings to transform nature in order to create civilization. And civilization continues in today's context where we are technologically very advanced. We have the information technology revolution, right? So today's society is technologically very advanced if we have to compare it to past societies, but inherently we are transforming the environment in order to continue our existence. 2, we will learn why we need to understand this interface And by understanding this interface, we will try and locate contemporary society in this context of the interface. So we are also trying to understand past societies, their relationship with the environment, and two, how do we understand contemporary society in this context, or contemporary society's relationship with the environment. And by understanding and exploring the interface, we will appreciate our relationship with the environment, its significance, and also the continuity of life on this planet. And that is why engaging with understanding the exploration between this interface of environment and civilization becomes very, very central to our conceptualization or our relationship. Right. So first let us take up the concept of environment. What is environment? Of course, a very layperson's understanding, environment would mean nature. And what is nature? It is the mountains, it is the rivers, it is the forest, it is the clouds, it is sun, right? Nature. But environment is slightly different from nature. And why is this different? This is where we need to turn to the anthropologist called Tim Ingold. And in 2000, he wrote a book called The Perception of the Environment. And here he makes a very interesting observation. And his concept of environment, he says, is relative to the being whose environment it is. So the first point we need to understand is the concept of environment is a relative concept. That means it is from the point of the actors in the context of environment that we can understand the meaning of environment. It is a relative term, and the environment cannot exist without the organism, and the organism cannot exist without the context of the environment. So we need the environment and the organism. In our context, it is human beings or the beings within the context of environment. That means we cannot separate the environment and the being. If we want to understand the being, we have to understand their environment, and if we want to understand the environment, we will have to understand the beings from whose perspective or whose eyes are we trying to understand the environment. And that is why environment and beings are inseparable. And this takes us to another point, which is that environments are always under construction. And what do we mean by this? That means environments are constantly being constructed on a daily basis. As long as there is life and activities going on in it, environments will be constantly influenced by the beings, and the environment will also be influencing the beings located in the context. In other words, what Ingold is emphasizing, that it is a relational understanding that we need to consider. That means the environment is not something just given out there, but can only be understood in relation to beings within it, and this within it becomes the key word to understand the concept of environment. So environment in relation to beings within the context of environment. And this is where we should not confuse the word environment with nature, because nature is something where the being is not there. That's not possible, because any natural phenomena or any environmental context, the beings are constantly there. So environment is something different from nature. Both these terms are differentiated, as I said before, based on the perspectives of the being living within the world and as beings without it. So nature is something to be external to human beings, but environment is living within and the relationship which is constructed. And it is a relative concept, as mentioned earlier, and this is being done to just reiterate the point that it pertains to beings within the world. And this is where environments take on meanings by beings within it. And in our context, if we are trying to understand the environment in relation to human societies or human beings, it is human beings who constantly shape the environment, and the environment shapes the human being. Say for example, in the mountainous regions, sometimes agriculture is not possible in terms of a settled or flat agriculture, and this is where communities resort to, say, terrace cultivation, and sometimes even terrace cultivation is not possible. People adapt to that environment by resorting to pastoralism, and this is why we can understand how environments are shaping human beings and how human beings are relating to the environment through their cultural activities. And that is why human beings shape environment, and environment also shapes human life. And this is where the concept of civilization becomes very important, because civilization is usually understood as a historical concept. Yes, it is true that yes, if you're trying to locate the origins of human life, human society, we need to go back to the origins of civilization. As the anthropologist Maurice Godelier rightly points out, he says human beings have history because they transform nature. So our idea of past or the idea of civilization comes by the capability of human beings to transform nature. In other words, we have the ability to create civilizations. But how is this ability there? By using our knowledge systems, using culture, and the capability to transform the environment. And that is what gives us an idea of history. And this makes us different from our other species, say like animals, right? They do not create history like human beings. And that is why Maurice Godelier talks about we have history because we have the capability to transform nature. And how do we transform nature? By using culture, right? By evolving technology. And technology then becomes an important way of how we not only interact with the environment, but we can also change the environment. And then the environment also responds, and then human beings interact in that manner, right? Okay, what is civilization then? We had some understanding of the concept of environment. Now we will turn to the concept of civilization. And this is where we need to understand the contribution of an archaeologist called V. Gordon Childe. And he writes a classic in 1936 called Man Makes Himself. The title is very interesting, Man Makes Himself. What does he mean by this? He's talking about the capability of human beings to transform nature and hence assure their own survival. In Man Makes Himself, he talks about the origins of civilization in what he identifies as the urban revolution. And what is the urban revolution? It is those conditions that gave rise to the first urban spaces. In other words, he's talking about the first beginnings of the city or the town or the urban space, where there was writing used as a medium, right? And all the changes that came along by the beginning of the city. That means the transformations in the social and economic organization of human life was the marker of civilization or the beginning of the urban revolution. But what gave a rise to the urban revolution? And this is where he introduces another concept called the Neolithic Revolution. And this happened around 10,000 before current era. And this is where human societies for the first time began cultivation. In other words, they began agriculture. And by cultivating, they began settling down for the first time. And by settling down, this gave a rise to the first urban centers. And before that, people were resorting to a nomadic lifestyle where people were hunter and gatherers. They were gathering food and they were hunting wild animals. And because animals were constantly moving, they are wild animals, human beings also had to organize themselves to move around to capture these animals, because it was a matter of survival, it was a matter of food. So whatever nature gave, they tried tapping it and living by it. In other words, it was a time where the environment was influencing human beings. In other words, human beings did not have a great control over nature. And once agriculture was discovered in the context of the Neolithic Revolution, and which led to urban spaces, human beings began controlling nature to a great extent, because they could guarantee food for themselves. They could be rest assured that they are not going to die of starvation, or food is not going to be provided by nature. In this sense, they started creating assurance from nature. With the discovery of agriculture, they could try and start controlling nature to a great extent. And this, of course, led to cultivation, the cultivation of many crops, and this had larger implications on the social and economic life of people. It also led to the emergence of the political systems. In other words, it led to the idea of control, people controlling other people, organizing themselves, the idea of the city emerging as a more organized way of life, where members not only dealt with the economic aspects of what we were producing, what we were redistributing, but also how to administer a population. And this all was happening in the context of the urban revolution, or because of the Neolithic Revolution, or what Gordon Childe identifies is the beginnings of civilization, or the beginnings of life in the context of human beings, where we were writing our own history. And this is where he identifies his book as Man Makes Himself. In other words, human beings are responsible of how we are shaping our relationship with the environment, and how in that process we are giving our own identity a sense of history. And this is where he talks about our relationship with the environment. Once agriculture began, people began resorting to a settled life, right? And that is where agriculture became a very important source of subsistence. Subsistence means survival here, and agriculture becomes very, very important for our lives. People start settling. Where do they start settling? They start settling all along the banks of the rivers, and that is why we find the early civilizations, whether it is the Indus Valley civilization or whether it is the Nile civilization in the context of Egypt, they all began on the banks of the rivers, because rivers were central for cultivation, because we needed water. So human beings learned the art of channelizing water. First, of course, they understood the flood patterns, then they started channelizing water to assure agriculture, for a continuation of agricultural cycles. So settlements of population led to an increase in population, because once people began settling, they had agriculture, they were assured of food. Food was guaranteed, and since food was guaranteed, now they could support more mouths, and population increase led to further extension of agriculture in the context of taking more land for the cultivation of crops. And this increase in population had equations on increase in cultivation, which again had an influence on increase in population. In other words, what emerged, what Gordon Childe says, is a social surplus. And this social surplus was in the terms of the grains which were produced. And once there was a social surplus, this had implications on human society, in the sense that it was no longer required by human beings to engage only with agriculture. This led to some people producing food while others exploring other ways of doing different activities. In other words, this led to other economic forms of activities. In other words, there was economic specialization because food was now guaranteed by a section of people who were going to produce food, while the others could now do other activities. And this is where we find the idea of craftsmen emerging, a class of merchants who would trade goods and services, and we find officials and priests who were residing in the city but taking care of the affairs of the city. Officials would document, they would write what is being produced, what all resources that we require. All this was being documented by the officials. In other words, there was a municipal organization emerging in the context of early civilizations. But this was all possible only if a social surplus was being created. And this is all which is happening in the context of the early civilization. And I am going to quote from another anthropologist called Elman Service, who identifies what a civilization is. And he says, the surplus was extracted by the governments who stored in huge monuments, and a ruling class of upper level of priests, civil and military leaders and officials, numerical notation and writing, beginnings of arithmetic, geometry and astronomy, sophisticated art styles, long distance trade, and finally an institutionalized form of political organization based on force termed the state is what emerged in the context of civilization. In other words, the social surplus led to the emergence of a class system. In other words, human beings were now organized around different classes of people who did different economic activities. In other words, they practiced or pursued different livelihoods. And all this was possible in the context of the urban space. So what are the characteristics of civilization or the beginnings of civilization? One is the ruling class of people who dealt with not only the economic but the political activities of the first cities and the urban spaces. We have civil and military leaders, we have officials, we have numerical notation and writing. That means human beings for the first time discovered ways of documenting. Till then it was all based on memory, on oral way of communicating what the ideas were. But for the first time human beings could write it down, record it, where other people could also read, and it leads to a better organized administration. From that point of view, writing becomes central. We could record things, we could communicate using writing. In other words, for the first time scripts had emerged in the context of human society. And this led to the beginnings of mathematics, arithmetic, geometry. People began, in other words, the earliest people who were philosophers began speculating on the idea of beings in the context of human life, the philosophy behind it, or in other words, they started also exploring astronomy, the place of human beings or the planet in the larger context of the universe. And all these economic activities had to be sustained by a long distance trade. So trade was an important aspect between civilizations, and this is where technology, inventions of the boat, seafaring, meeting other people, meeting other civilizations, trading, in other words, a class of merchants who were dealing with these goods also had to emerge, right? And finally, what emerged in the context of the urban space was a strong political system, where, in other words, the beginnings of the state, where people controlled not only resources but also controlled people. They assured the people who were producing food and the different economic activities some kind of security or guarantee, and in return people had to contribute their labor power, the surplus that they produced, which was then given to the state or the ruling class of elites who were in control of these resources. Let us sum up on what civilization is. Civilization is the whole mechanism and organization which human beings have created to control not only their own conditions of life but also control the environment, because as human societies evolved, technology also evolved. In other words, technology had to be invented in order to adapt to the environment. That is why we are talking about human beings creating not only a control and conditions of their own lives but also the environment. This also includes the system of social organization and also techniques and material instruments. That means the board, writing, measurements, artifacts which human beings have created, all this is in relation to the environment. In other words, what emerged was a stronger sense of control of natural phenomena, because human beings learnt how nature is behaving and that they could alter their own lives. When if there was a flood, they could respond to it by channelizing the flood or maybe moving to another place. These were ways of trying to deal with the environment. In other words, controlling nature became very, very central. And in other words, civilization is basically the techniques and regulations of human behavior. So for example, the evolution of the ballot box by which we vote our own representatives, the invention of the telephone, or for that matter, guaranteeing human rights and the Human Rights Commission which takes care of or ensures that human rights are not violated, the banks and the banking system, the railway system, law and schools, all these are aspects of civilization. In other words, the whole organization, social, political, economic, is what is in the context of civilization. What did we learn till now? We looked at the concept of environment and we also looked at the concept of civilization. Then we tried understanding the concept of civilization as given by Gordon Childe. What are the factors that give rise to civilizations and what are the features that make up civilization? What was central to the whole theme is that civilization is possible only by transforming nature. The ability of human beings to bring about a change in the environment has led to the formation of environment. In other words, environment and civilization cannot be separated. And that is what the next question would logically be. Is civilization possible without the environment, or is environment possible without civilization? And you know the answer, perhaps it would be no, because if environment means beings within it, so we cannot separate civilization and environment, because from early times human beings have been transforming their environment, and by transforming their environment they are also transforming their civilization, because each time human beings create technology to interact with the environment, they are not only bringing about change in the context of the environment but also changing their own society. So this is why civilization is not going to be possible without the context of the environment, and by transforming their civilization, human beings are also transforming their environment to a point where it has reached very difficult situations, like say for example we are talking about global climate change because of human activities, right? Or we are talking about waste which is generated. All this is creating a problem for human beings. When this relationship between environment and civilization cannot be maintained or cannot be sustained, this can have negative outcomes on human societies, right? And this will lead to the point of disintegration not only of the environment but also of human beings. In other words, human life becomes threatened, right? Human societies or civilizations, it's difficult for them to sustain, and this would lead to a complete breakdown or disintegration of life. But what is the basis of this relationship, or rather how do we understand this relationship? The relationship between environment and people or civilization, is it just one relationship, or can there be different ways of understanding this relationship? And this is where we will turn to another anthropologist called Gisli Palsson. And Gisli Palsson, he suggests 3 paradigms of understanding human and environment relationships, and he calls these 3 paradigms: one is Orientalism, 2 paternalism, and 3 communalism. Right? Communalism should not be understood as dislike for other societies. No, it is the idea of living as a community in relationship with the environment, where people see themselves as part of the environment, and the environment is also part of people's lives. They are very deep perceptions of conceptualizing the environment. So what are Orientalism, paternalism, and communalism? Orientalism and paternalism, the central idea of these 2 paradigms is that they see themselves as separate to the environment. In other words, here society and environment are separate entities. Both Orientalism and paternalism view human beings as the center of relationships, and they see themselves as masters of nature. In other words, they can control nature. So in Orientalism and paternalism, there is an assumption that human beings are masters of the environment. That means they can dictate how the environment can react, or in other words, they can manipulate in the processes of the environment. So they see environment and societies as separate. Orientalism, because it assumes that they are masters of nature, they can exploit nature, right? This understanding is that you can exploit nature for human needs, and this has been the central theme in the whole colonialism which has happened in the context of human society, where people's view of nature is that it is a commodity, it has to be extracted and used. So we see in different colonies how the environment was plundered for the benefit of the colonizers, because this view emerges that environment can be used for the ends of human beings, and it's a commodity and can be exploited. On the other hand, paternalism assumes that human beings are masters of nature and they can protect nature, where, for example, environmental movements or animal rights movements, they argue that it is human beings who have the responsibility to save the environment and also the other species, and by doing so they are going to save human beings, and human beings are a separate set of species who can take care of the environment. So it assumes that human beings are slightly higher above the other species and the environment, and that is why it is important that human beings need to do something in order to save the environment or protect the environment or protect species. On the other hand, if we look at communalism as a paradigm, it rejects the very separation of the environment and people. How do they do it? In these kind of societies, people see themselves as part of the environment, and the environment is also part of human beings. They cannot be separate. They are one unit. In other words, they are not separate units. And this relationship between the environment and people is very close, intimate and personal, right? That means environment is an extension of human society, and the human society is an extension of the environment. And this relationship of environment and people is based on a relationship of engagement, one that rests on a monologue, but rather it rests on the idea of a dialogue. And Orientalism, it rests on a monologue where people are influencing nature, or they can control nature, or they take the destiny of nature in their hands. In the communalism paradigm, it is where societies or communities, they reject the very idea of a separation between environment and society. What I mean by reject is their own perception about the environment is seen as that environment is an extension of human life, and human life is also an extension of the environment. And these societies is what Philippe Descola calls the societies of nature, because people see themselves as part of the environment. Relationships with the environment are viewed as close, personal and intimate. Terms like brother, mother, father are used for relating to the environment. Even animals are seen as kin members, and this is where the extension of relationship is that of human beings relating to the environment. And this relationship is based on an engagement. It is an engagement where there is a constant dialogue between the environment and people. It is not a monologue, unlike what we saw in paternalism and Orientalism, where people see themselves as higher and above the environment, and they can influence and control the environment. On the other hand, communalism sees the environment and human beings as equal, and that is why it is a dialogue. See, for example, in hunting and gathering societies, people relate to the wild animals as if it is a cooperative process. They see the animals as if interacting with people and allowing them to hunt the animals. There is a kind of play between the animal and the hunter, right? In other words, it is seen as a relationship between between two lovers, where one is appealing to the lover in the process of catching the animal. So it is a dialogue and not a monologue, where animals are also responding and the human being is also responding, and this is where the hunt takes place. In another example, many agricultural communities see the land as a mother, because it is constantly a giver of products. It's constantly giving produce from the earth. On the other hand, there are pastoral societies which herd many animals, see their animals as mother too, because they are dependent on the animal for its milk. So that is why the relationship between the animals, the environment, is seen as one that is a giver. In other words, it is a very intimate relationship. And this perception of the environment has implications on how people relate to the environment. And this is where it is an urgent need to reconsider the way we relate to the environment, particularly in the context of where there is industrial revolution, there is industrial technology, there is advancement of modern technology which is being used, or in today's context of the global climate change, and the kind of catastrophes which are emerging by the use of such technology, and where society is constantly at risk. And that is where looking at how communities and societies relate to the environment could be a clue of how we can also relate or change the way we relate to the environment by understanding the intimate relationship of these various paradigms of how they look at the relationship between people and the environment. And this is becoming a very important need, particularly in today's context, where there is a rapid growth of economies. In other words, there's large-scale consumerism, large-scale production of goods and services, and in today's context of globalization, where goods and services have become global, they can move from different places very quickly, right? Today you have aviation, or the idea of air transport, which can take people very fast. Goods can be produced in one corner of the world and be sent to another corner of the world, or resources which is coming from nature is taken from one part of the world and is produced elsewhere and sold across. In this rapid pace of growing economies and production of goods and services, all this is happening at the cost of exploiting resources. In other words, it's coming at the cost of exploiting the environment. On the other hand, there is a kind of contradiction, or there is a problem, because the rate at which economies and goods and services being produced are growing, the resources of the planet are not growing at the same pace, because the Earth's capacity to supply the ecological services, say like fresh water, seafood, forests, these are not increasing at the pace at which our economies are growing, and this creates a larger pressure on the limited resources of the planet. And the current demands of the economy, of people, are being met by extracting the Earth's resources, or in other words, the natural resources, to the point of where the environment is pushed to the point of decline, or in terms of a collapse of the ecosystems. And this decline or the collapse has disastrous implications not only on present day civilization, but it also has implications on the environment. But is this threat of a collapse or decline only to contemporary societies, or has this happened in the past? Though today we are living in a very technologically advanced civilization, right? We have everything nano in some sense. So is there a threat of collapse also for so-called modern day technological civilizations, or has this happened in the past? This has happened also in the past. Civilizations of the past have also faced ecological catastrophes. Some of them have managed to design techniques of adjustments to these changes, while others reached a point of complete breakdown. Though our civilization, which is an industrial civilization, and our technology is very sophisticated, it does not ensure the survival of our civilization. Like previous civilizations have collapsed, there is always a threat for the contemporary civilizations also to break down or reach a point of collapse, or what the naturalist and biologist Jared Diamond calls ecological suicide or ecocide. And these civilizations are victims of an ecological crisis, and this has happened in the past. We cannot rule out, if the way we continue of extracting resources, that today's societies may head that way. So in the past we have the Anzai within today's United States of America, the Mayan cities of Central America, the Moche and Minoan Crete in Europe, the Great Zimbabwe in Africa, the Angkor Wat and the Indus Valley in Asia, and the Easter Islands in Pacific. All these civilizations have been the victims of ecocide. How could such civilizations that were centers that flourished with people, with populations, with economic activities, how could they collapse? Or why did they vanish? Or why did they disintegrate? But before we understand the reasons behind it, we need to understand what do we mean by collapse here. Collapse does not mean that everything vanished or became extinct. By collapse, what we understand is the famous archaeologist Srinivas Ratnagar, in a book Understanding Harappa, observes collapse does not mean that people disappear or become extinct. What disappeared in these civilizations was the coherence of the civilization as an overarching system with its regional craftsmen, modes of elite control, and systems of long distance procurement of materials. This is from a book Understanding Harappa, and I am quoting from page number 139. In other words, the overarching system which controls the relationship between people and the relationship between the environment, that breaks down. In other words, after the breakdown, people may disperse to different places and they carry elements of culture to new places which mix with other cultures. So by collapse, we do not mean a complete extinction of the culture, but rather the continuation of the cultural elements in different places, but the overarching system in the context of the civilization, that breaking down. So what are the reasons for the collapse or disintegration of early civilizations? Most of the reasons are ascribing ecological destruction, in other words, how human beings destroy the environment, as the only reason for the collapse of civilization. For example, how Jerry Diamond writes, it has long been suspected that many of those mysterious abandonments were at least partly triggered by ecological problems. People inadvertently destroying the environmental resources on which their societies depended. In other words, the reason given for the collapse of civilizations is that the human beings overexploited the environment, and that led to the destruction of civilization. However, whether the collapse of civilizations was resulting because of the destruction of the environment by people, or there were other factors like natural calamities or internal reorganization of relationships within society leading to the collapse of civilizations, is highly debated by archaeologists. However, one cannot ignore environmental factors to the disintegration of civilizations. In other words, the role that people have in overexploiting or destroying the environment. These environmental factors Diamond identifies as deforestation, habitat destruction, soil problems, overhunting, overfishing, introduction of exotic species, human population growth, and increased per capita income impact of people. These factors have led to the collapse of civilizations. And if what Diamond says is the collapse of early societies have followed a similar path. Population growth forced people to adopt intensive means of agricultural production, in other words, irrigation, double cropping, terracing, and this led to the expansion of farmlands to marginal lands to feed more mouths, and this led to unsustainable practices which led to environmental damage. So as population increased, more and more land was brought under cultivation. This led to unsustainable practices which led to the damage of the environment, and this resulted in food scarcity, starvation and wars, combined with the distrust in the promises made by their leaders in fulfilling promises of prosperity led to the people overthrowing the rulers. In other words, what we see is society lost its political, economic and cultural organization that it enjoyed in its peak as a working civilization. So once the environment was destroyed, it also had implications on the internal arrangements or the social relationship between the economic, the political and the cultural organization, which led finally to the collapse of the civilization. And this has been the story of civilizations which did not survive, but as I said earlier, that cultural elements continued. However, there have been survivors in spite of this context of collapse that we are talking about. There were societies which, following a communalism paradigm, have managed to sustain themselves for many thousand years. And how did they do that? This is by the relationship, trying to relate with the environment in a nature of relationship which is very intimate, very personal, and this resulted in practices which not only sustained people but also protected the environment. And there are civilizations and societies that have survived as they could devise cultural mechanisms to foresee and mitigate a collapse like situation. For example, amongst the New Guinea tribal communities, as Drymond points out, they adopted a bottom-up management approach. In other words, they understood the environment and tried responding to the environment in a very harmonious manner. People there have been living self-sustainably for 46,000 years, and this is an example of the communalism paradigm. And how did they do this? In other words, how were they self-sustaining the community? The New Guinea people have been planting a tree called Casuarina in villages and gardens, and these trees provide all the wood requirements. At the same time, they are excellent nitrogen fixers, and we know that nitrogen is very important for the nutrition of the soil, which then results in a good crop production or the sustenance of the plants. This increases soil fertility. The roots bind with the soil, and this prevents any kind of soil erosion. At the same time, they believe that growing this tree reduces the infestation of the taro beetle, which can be detrimental to the soil and the crops. The trees have solved their wood supply. They have constantly been a source of wood supply and maintained soil fertility, and by this the New Guinea people could foresee any kind of collapse like situation which may have emerged, and they have managed to continue remaining sustainable. In another example coming from India, where people have used a communal paradigm in relating to the environment, comes from the hills of Uttarakhand in India, where the people resorted to a non-violent, peaceful resistance in the Garhwal Himalayas, which came to be known as the Chipko movement, which was a grassroots struggle to protect the forests. And protect the forests from whom? Contractors who were trying to cut down forests for commercial exploitation and sale, where women and men of the villages began hugging trees. They fasted in order to protest the contractors cutting down the trees. They tied threads to the trees as a symbolic gesture of guardianship, and this they did to prevent the contractors from cutting down the trees. Demands were made by villagers to take complete ecological control over the forest resources, the forests, the trees, and also the extraction of minor forest produce, supply of fodder and water which came from the forest. So people made a claim over these resources that they have to be complete in control, or the resources should be under their possession, not under the state's possession, and the state responded to the demands of the villagers, and this movement was very successful, where people managed to take control of their own resources. But this was possible only if people viewed the forest and the environment as part of themselves, and that is why they hugged in order to show their love and affection for the environment, because the environment is very, very crucial for the survival of the local economy. And the Chipko movement was a big step in towards showing this relationship and also protecting the environment. But however, there are many contemporary environment problems, what Jaden Diamond identifies as air and water pollution, acid rains, depletion of ozone layer, global warming, spread of radioactive material, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, extinction of species, soil erosion, and overpopulation. And these are a constant threat to the continuation and sustainability of civilization, particularly in the context of technologically driven civilizations such as ours, and these will continue to be a problem unless we address them seriously. And for our civilization and the environment to survive, we need to alter our perception. We need to change the way we look at the environment. We need to rethink how we conceptualize ourselves and our environment and the relationship between the environment and people. Remember that an environment cannot be conceptualized without the organism, and here we are talking about the human being, and it is vice versa, that the environment cannot be conceptualized without human beings. So if we constantly destroy the environment, in other words, we are also destroying ourselves, because the environment is the being within the context of the environment. Perhaps a communalism based paradigm may be a light to the end of the dark tunnel. Trying to understand the relationship of communities which have used the communalism paradigm may be a step in rethinking our own relationship with the environment, so that we can perhaps see or deal with the kind of collapse that may result from this kind of relationship, which is based on very paternalistic and a kind of Orientalism based kind of paradigm. Thank you.